Good morning to you all. I want to introduce you to our second lecturer this morning, Professor Guy Claxton, who will be addressing us on building learning power. BLP is an approach to teaching and learning that has three proven effects. Students get better results, students are better prepared for the real-world challenges of the 21st century, and very importantly to us, teachers' jobs become easier and more rewarding. In this opening lecture, Professor Claxton will lay out the whys, the hows, and the evidence of the results of this approach to creating learning cultures in schools and colleges. Guy Claxton.
Thank you very much indeed. It's lovely to be back here in Buenos Aires. It was quite a night with the storm and the lightning and all the thunder and everything, so I didn't sleep quite as much as I would have liked. But it's great to be here. Wasn't that a fantastic speech from Sugata? Fantastic. This man is a magician. It's like wherever he goes, he sets up some small experiment that startles us, surprises us. It's just like he sees more than most people do about what's possible or what's intriguing or what's awkward. But I come to reassure you that you don't have to create classrooms that are immediately chaotic on Monday morning. This is the good news. So I'm a kind of middleman. I'm interested, very interested, in the possibilities that Sugata's research opens up. But I want to start with another question, which is perhaps complementary to his approach, because we require children to go through school for I don't know how long in Argentina, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. It's a long time. And for what? What's the goal? What's the desired outcome of that long period of time? This is, I don't know if you can read this. This is another magician. He said once upon a time, education is what remains after one has forgotten everything you learnt at school. So I'm very interested in what is it that remains after your students have forgotten, like you have, how to solve simultaneous equations, unless you're a mathematics teacher, or the irregular verbs in some language that you never use anymore. What's the remnant? What is the residue of that 12 years or so? And is it what we want it to be? Are we thinking carefully enough, not just about the examination system and university entrance and qualifications and the economy and the content of the syllabus, but what are those valuable residues that we would like all our young people to have after they've forgotten much, I wouldn't say all, after they've forgotten much of what they learnt at school. So to start thinking about that, I'd like you to do a little exercise with me. This is good teaching, as you know, has an engaging starter activity at the beginning of the lesson. If you're an old-fashioned teacher, not a Mitra-like teacher, you have a good starter activity. So I'd like you to look at that list of things and then just have a conversation with your neighbor about whether there are maybe, let's say, 3 of those that jump out at you as being qualities of mind or attitudes or mental skills or habits that you think all young Argentinians would need in order to flourish in the real world, in order to do well in the world as you know it to be, the world of the 21st century. So would you just for a minute have a chat with your neighbor and see if there are some of those. You could make a case for all of them, but I want your top 3. Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed. That would be fantastic. Great. Thank you very much. So, would anybody like to volunteer? Which of those jump out at you as being at the top of your list? Yeah, please. Being adventurous. Well done for being adventurous. Yes, being willing to try some new things, not being afraid of a new challenge, not always having to look good at everything in order to learn something new. Yeah, please. Questioning things. That could mean a lot of things, but I think for me it means just having an inquisitive attitude to life, asking, how come and why did that, and maybe, but also questioning things that you're told or questioning things that you read. Not just accepting things passively. Is that not an important life skill in the 21st century? It's a cliche, isn't it? Getting knowledge is easy, but checking knowledge, testing knowledge, customizing knowledge, that's tricky. Yes, next one. Sorry? Discussing with peers. It's a social world, isn't it? Exactly. Sugata's experiments demonstrate that crucially. You make education much more difficult than it need to be if you diminish the amount of free discussion amongst the children. And you will discuss in your schools, you plan, you cooperate, you organize things together. So working together and discussing with others. One more? Imagining possible solutions. So again, having a mindset which is like, maybe we could, or I wonder what would happen if, or perhaps we might, or not being stuck quickly for something, having a mind that can think around a problem, come up with new ideas. Okay, now, you will either be irritated or relieved to know that you are like most audiences. Depending on your personality structure, you will either find that irritating to be like other people or relieved that you are like other people. Most people tend to pick out the green things from those lists, the things that you picked out. Let me show you the same list again and ask you a different question. Which of those do we traditionally most ask of children in school? Okay, thank you very much. I hoped that would be what we would call a rhetorical question. Traditionally, in the traditional good school, it was the red things, wasn't it? We wanted children to be quiet, sit down, do what they're told, be accurate, remember facts accurately, and so on. That was the 19th century model of the good school. Now, all the schools that I work with are somewhere on a journey from that predominantly red-sided methodology, pedagogy in schools, to something that embraces more of the green side, and which does it in a way that makes teachers' jobs easier and raises the conventional results. Make sure you're getting the scores on the tests that you need to get, but does it in a way that systematically cultivates young people who are more independent, more questioning, more resilient, more resourceful as they go about learning. And that, for me, that's the question, because it makes life easier and more enjoyable for everybody in school, and obviously, as you've just said, it prepares young people better for life. So that's the question that Building Learning Power, or BLP, which we call it, starts from. If you line up all the red things on one side of this slide and you line up all the green things on the other side of the slide, you get a particular perspective on what we do in schools. Of course, content and assessment are important, but this is a different lens through which we look at what's going on in our classrooms. We look at classrooms as mind training places, places where day after day we invite young people to exercise different aspects of their minds and therefore strengthen those aspects, and not to use other aspects of their mind and therefore neglect or even weaken those aspects of their minds. Put from this point of view, you could be forgiven for thinking that the traditional good education was a 12-year apprenticeship. Very expensive, very time-consuming apprenticeship in developing the mindset of a 19th century clerk, couldn't you? Someone who was punctual, polite, deferential, accurate, reliable, and so on, as opposed to being a 21st century explorer. Not that all these are useless. Of course not. We've just lost more light, but we could have a little bit more light on the audience so I can see you as well as you can see me. Not that all the red-sided things are useless, but if you look at the job advertisements in the Buenos Aires daily paper, there will not be many advertisements that say applicants must be able to sit still for long periods, copy down notes, and regurgitate facts. They're not useless, but they're not at the top of people's lists. So I'm a professor, and I like being a professor. I have certain character defects, as professors do, and one is to occasionally enjoy using a long phrase, complicated language. And this is my complicated phrase for today. What kind of epistemic apprenticeship are we putting young people through? Epistemic just means to do with thinking and learning and knowing. You know that. There must be a good word in Spanish, right? Epistemikos or something like that. Right? Yeah? Okay. So how are we going to address this agenda? I want to draw 4 lessons out of this initial starter activity. First of all, it's really important that we realize that these general capabilities that we're talking about need to be described as habits or attitudes or values. They're not merely skills. People sometimes talk about this territory in terms of soft skills or life skills or 21st century skills or thinking skills or learning skills. But skills is the wrong word. Having an inquisitive mindset is not a skill. It's an attitude. It's a way you meet the world, isn't it? It's more than a skill. David Perkins from Harvard, who is one of my gurus, one of my teachers, has done some lovely research, which he boils down very beautifully into this insight. A skill is something you can do, but not necessarily something you do. If I ask you, can you play the piano? You might say yes. If I ask you, do you play the piano? You might say, well, not since the children came, or since I got my new job, or something like that. So the skill and the disposition are different. And if we want to help young people develop these valuable residues of their 12 years in schooling, those residues have to be attitudes and dispositions and not just skills, which is why skills training approaches to this territory usually result in disappointing effects. There are usually 3 effects of training youngsters in thinking skills. The first is they enjoy it, usually because it's light relief from the tedium of the rest of the curriculum. But secondly, those benefits don't last and they don't spread to other areas of their life and other subjects. And that's because we haven't done what it takes to work those skills into habits, to make them part of their dispositions. Secondly, the good news is that we now know that these dispositions or habits are themselves learnable. We can coach young people to become more resilient, more inquisitive, more independent, more imaginative. It's within our power to do that. Because these are habits of mind and therefore learnt, they're also coachable. And that opens up the possibility that we could pay more explicit attention in our classrooms to thinking, how could I coach the development of these habits? That leads us to the third perspective, which is key to the Building Learning Power approach, which is that teaching for these general capabilities doesn't involve bolting something new on to what we do in school, but to thinking about and adjusting our own habits as teachers. It's not just if you paste something new on top of normal behavior in the classroom, it won't win, the new thing won't win. If the underlying messages of the classroom are still to do with accuracy and deference and retention, if there's still a red-sided culture, it's no use trying to paste some green, fancy ideas over the top of that. That's either good news or bad news, depending on how you think about it. It's bad news because it means we have to look at ourselves. We have to be willing to change a little bit. It's good news because we can. It's within our power. You don't have to wait for the Minister of Education to tell you about this or to tell you how to do it. It's something that any teacher could change in any classroom whenever they liked. Fourthly, everyone always teaches these general capabilities. You can't not. We had a shift in our national curriculum in England a little while ago, where the curriculum for 11 to 14-year-olds now revolved much. It's been forgotten since then. So once upon a time, from 2007 to 2010, revolved around the development of what we called personal learning and thinking skills. They still used the language of skills in those days. And I went into a school and I heard a maths teacher say in a rather weary and cynical voice, I'm a maths teacher and I'm a good maths teacher. I get good results. And now they're telling me I've got to teach bloody thinking as well. But the truth is, he always had been teaching thinking. The question is, what kind of thinking had he been teaching? What kind of mental attitudes had he been developing? Let me give you another example from a different discipline, from history. In England, we have a topic that is deemed to be so important in history that young people have to do it at least 3 times as they go through school. And each time they do it, their teachers don't believe that they've done it before. It's called the Tudors. Now, I had a quick look on the internet this morning, but I couldn't find what is the Argentine equivalent of the Tudors. What is it? Okay, well, you know what it is. So I want to describe 2 lessons to you about a historical episode or a historical event. And I want you to be thinking while I describe these, what are the skills of learning? What are the skills of learning that are being used in that lesson? How do students see their job as a learner? And what's the conception of knowledge that underlies that lesson? Here's the first one. The students walk into the room. The teacher has projected a lot of notes onto the whiteboard or written them on the blackboard. The students have to copy them down as quickly and as accurately as they can into their notebooks. When they've done that, they have to read quietly on their own some pages in their history textbook. And at the end of the lesson, they're given a multiple choice test to establish their factual comprehension. Is this familiar kind of lesson to you? Okay. The question I want you to be thinking about is, what are the skills of learning? How do students see their job as a learner? What conception of knowledge is in play in that lesson? It will become clearer when I contrast that with a different lesson. Same content, same subject matter. Here's the second lesson. The students walk in and their teacher has written rather cryptically on her whiteboard, history is the story written by the winners. Any history teachers know who said that? Napoleon Bonaparte. Then they have a big discussion, the whole class, about what that means and whether that implies that historical accounts and historical documents are necessarily always partial, biased, written by someone from a point of view. We don't have to look at the two histories of the Malvinas to understand this issue, do we? Yeah. Therefore, all historical accounts are provisional, open to question, subject to challenge. Then the students are set in pairs to read a few pages of their textbook in order to try and unearth, to bring to the surface, what are the unstated assumptions of the writer? What's the writer's worldview? What is he or she deciding is not worth talking about in this historical period? Does he decide that it's worth telling us about how the Tudors washed or what they had for breakfast? Or is it not considered to be worthwhile? What opinions of his own are being passed off as facts? I'll call him male for the point of illustration. What facts are being presented as if they were self-evidently true without any need for a warrant or evidence behind them, and so on. So the students, I've seen low ability 11-year-olds do this task perfectly well. Right? Then at the end of the lesson, the students are asked to do a piece of writing about a historical event in that period through the eyes of 3 different people. What would that have been like, felt like, if you had been Queen Elizabeth I or Mary Queen of Scots or the Lord Chancellor? You can translate that into your own topics. So my question is, are the skills of learning different in those 2 lessons? Is a student's job as a learner, do they see themselves as having a different job in those 2 lessons? And even the conception of knowledge, is that different in those 2 lessons? 30-second chat with your neighbour. Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to try and stop you again. Okay. So my point is, well, let's have a look. In the first lesson, the skills of learning are what? Solo reading, quiet reading on your own, transcribing notes, an attitude of passivity and acceptance of what you're being told in the first lesson, and of limited kinds of recall of information. In the second lesson, skills of discussion, of analysis, of critical reading, and of imagination and empathy. Same material, same content being used in those 2 lessons as an exercise machine to develop different mental habits. And that's the freedom we have in classes, isn't it? We always have the freedom, whatever we're teaching, to be, we are always somewhere on that spectrum, from teaching compliance and literal understanding and passivity and dependency, or teaching resilience and independence and imagination and discussion and resourcefulness, just as those wonderful examples of Sugatas are teaching kids, drawing out of them, relying on, but also strengthening their ability to be imaginative, to make experiments, to explore, to make mistakes, to tinker their way rapidly towards competence. And we can do more of that in regular classrooms. That's my point. Okay, so there's always something going on below the line. And what's going on below the line is the most important thing that's happening in lessons. That cumulative cultivation of habits and attitudes towards learning and knowing. Above the line, in what I call the shallows, we're very familiar with, are they retaining the knowledge? Are they learning to fluently talk about it? Can they use it under certain limited circumstances, particularly on examination tests? But below the line, we're always inviting and cultivating wider habits of learning, attitudes, values, and interests in young people, even a sense of their own identity as learners and the place they have in the world of knowledge creation and knowledge critiquing. In my first lesson, students experience themselves only as knowledge consumers. In my second lesson, they are being encouraged to experience themselves as knowledge makers, knowledge critics, knowledge shapers, knowledge customizers. Now, which of those is a better preparation for life in the 21st century? And which of those gets better examination results? The answer is the second lesson. Gets better examination results and cultivates more useful habits broadly for life in the 21st century. If you look at the literature that relates to this perspective, you will find broadly 3 clusters of valuable outcomes of schooling, of what's going on below the line. And it's important to identify all 3 of those. The first, and perhaps the most basic, is to do with what's called self-regulation or self-control. We know from lots of very large international studies that people's success in life is powerfully predicted by how well they are able to concentrate, to sacrifice some short-term pleasures for long-term gains, to be able to sequence and prioritize and manage their own learning and their own behavior for themselves. In kindergarten and primary schools, we work a lot to develop these qualities of mind. We help children learn to develop the ability to know when and how to restrain themselves, when and how to be exuberant and spontaneous, to learn to be able to put on the brake as well as to tread on the accelerator of their own learning. So these are the skills, the basic skills, the foundation skills, if you like. The ability to concentrate, to resist distraction, to plan and organize, to be self-disciplined in your approach to learning, and to be self-aware, to know when and how to respond in different ways. A recent study by Angela Duckworth and Martin Seligman shows that in secondary schools, if you want to predict how well your students are going to be performing in 2 years' time, check their level of self-discipline. It's 2 times more powerful a predictor than their IQ. Twice as powerful a predictor as their IQ of how well they're going to be doing in life. Secondly, obviously, there are the social skills, skills of social harmony or attitudes, you might say, moral integrity, the things that we would like, that Pope Francis perhaps was pointing at in his pronouncement that was read to us this morning. Kindness, honesty, trustworthiness, the ability to be of service to other people, to put yourself in other people's shoes, to show moral courage. I'm going to take you back to this slide and draw your attention to these boys here. They're doing that piece of writing from the perspective of 3 different historical characters. To help them do that, They're 12 years old, these boys, in a public school in Cardiff, in the Dockland area of Cardiff, in Wales. To help them do that, their teacher has asked them to cut out of cardboard to make for themselves what they call their empathy spectacles. These empathy spectacles have the magical property that when you put them on, they enable you to see what the world looks like through someone else's eyes. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but they don't really. But it's smart teaching, because what that teacher is doing is using that bit of history as a way of exercising their empathy muscles, we would say, stretching and strengthening their ability to get inside the skin of someone who lived in a very different time, very different culture from their own. And the research shows us that the more a person possesses of the disposition of empathy, the ability to not jump to conclusions about someone else, not to judge other people quickly. As the Native Americans say, to walk a mile, don't judge someone until you have walked a mile in their moccasins. Right? This is the same kind of idea. What could be a stronger contribution to the development of world peace than the development of that disposition? So this teacher in her classroom is teaching history. She hasn't neglected the curriculum, but she's using it cleverly as a way of trying to cultivate over time in those young boys a really useful, valuable attitude for real life. And we could be doing much more of that in schools. The third category here is what I call the epistemic mentality, the capacity to learn, developing curiosity, craftsmanship, that commitment to doing the best you can, creativity and imagination, and collaboration, all the things that we saw in Sugata's wonderful film clips. So that's the curriculum. If you look around the world, you will find that language in the national curriculum of more and more countries. I've just picked out in red statements from the national curriculum of, for example, New Zealand. It's largely been neglected by the current government in New Zealand. These advances, these progresses in new curricula tend to get ignored because they're complicated and difficult, particularly by right-wing politicians. They don't get repealed, they just get neglected. But look at the language: creative, enterprising, developing values, developing confidence, developing lifelong learning. If you look at the national curriculum of Singapore, it's written about what they call the desired outcomes of learning. What are they? Confidence, adaptability, resilience, independence, critical thinking, questioning, reflection, perseverance, effective working with others, developing initiative, taking risks, and being innovative. It's all the green side stuff. If you look in Ireland, the islands next door to where I live, they've just created a new curriculum for their 11 to 14-year-olds, which they call the junior cycle. It's the same language: flexible, positive about learning, imagining, exploring options, taking risks, debating, learning with others, being curious, reflecting, and evaluating. All the things that the traditional pedagogy excluded, but all the things that 21st century pedagogy could develop without waiting for someone to change the examination system and without waiting for them to change the curriculum. We have enormous, the English expression is elbow room. I don't know what the Spanish expression is. We as individual teachers have a huge amount of elbow room to change the epistemic culture of our classrooms, if we choose to do so. Who is this for? Who are we talking about? Is it just the disadvantaged children? There's a very good new book published from the States this year by a man called Paul Tough. It's called How Children Succeed, in which he reviews a lot of research about one of the reasons why children from poor backgrounds don't do well in education is because they lack a supportive social network around them. They may do, not always, but they may do. One of the reasons that might contribute to this. Therefore, it's all the more important in schools that we help them develop those capacities for themselves. Self-discipline, self-regulation, being able to pick themselves up and have another go when they fail at something. A lot of this research came out of the movement for charter schools in the United States. You will probably know that there has been a big push across the US for getting poor kids to college. That was the push. And they were relatively successful. The charter schools were relatively successful at doing that. The only problem was they then dropped out at a rate of 70%. You could get poor kids to college, but once they got there, they didn't have the resilience, the inquisitiveness, the independence, the stamina to stay the course without the support of those caring, positive, pushing teachers behind them. Now, interestingly, this also happens when privileged youngsters go to their universities. They too have been overhelped by their teachers, so that when many of them get to Oxford or Cambridge, they flounder, they become anxious and depressed because they're struggling with the work that they have to do without the social safety net that they had before, and therefore they interpret their difficulties as being a sign that they are less intelligent than they thought they were. And that's a rather devastating realization. To suddenly wake up because you can't cope with your chemistry or your foreign language or your physiology, and to think to yourself, I'm an imposter. I don't belong here, really. I now realize that I don't have what it takes to be here. And that's not because they're not bright, it's because their teachers didn't help them develop the resilience and the independence and the resourcefulness to cope with the freedom that they're now experiencing in their schools. Here's an example from just one of these high-achieving students from a recent survey. This is Emily. She says, I know I'm bright, I'm going to get good grades, but I worry that I've become a tape recorder. I worry that once I'm out of school, when I go to university, and people stop handing me information with questions. That's what we do in schools traditionally, isn't it? We hand students information with questions. In other words, we've neatened it up so much. We've taken 95% of the juice, the jungle, the difficulty out of their learning. So we've deprived them of opportunities to learn how to learn for themselves. And Emily quite rightly says, I'm worried that I'll be lost. And the evidence from the counselling services at Oxford and Cambridge says she's right to be worried. She might be one of that 15% that ends up in the counsellor's waiting room. So this is not just remedial life skills for the disadvantaged, although it is for them. And it's not just something that's too sophisticated for the disadvantaged and only appropriate for the more able students. It's something that is of powerful relevance and significance to all of them. Now I want to ask you to do a little self-diagnosis. So here are a list of things that go on in classrooms. And I put against each of them a suggestion, it's no more than that, of what kind of mental habits are being exercised by that activity. So I'm just going to talk through the list, and at the end of the list, I want you to either do this in your mind or with a piece of paper, I want you to draw a circle on your piece of paper and draw a pie chart. You all know what a pie chart is? Good. Of the 5 most common activities that you routinely provide for the children in your classrooms in the right proportions. In other words, I want you to just see how clearly you can see yourself from this perspective as a mind trainer. Not a teacher of 4-year-olds or chemistry, but as someone who is constantly providing activities that get the kids to use their minds in different ways. So as I go through these, think to yourself, how much of my time with the children do I use this activity? 1%? 5%? 10%? 25%? 50%? Copying down notes. This develops the learning habits of acquiescence, doesn't it? And learning to transcribe things. So how much of the time in your lessons, over a term or over a year, let's say, do your students spend practicing acquiescence and transcription? Catechism, that question and answer that always goes via the teacher, in which you know what the right answer is, and their job is to try and guess what it is you want them to say. That builds the skills of mind reading, doesn't it? They're sitting there, they probably perfectly well know what it is, but they're just not sure what it is you want them to say right then. So they have to read your body language. They get very smart at doing that, don't they? Sitting there reading silently to themselves obviously builds the skills of solo comprehension. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not making any value judgments about these. So what proportion of the time do the children in your care spend silently reading? 1%? 10%? 50%? Small group discussions, learning to collaborate with each other in an open-ended kind of way. So these are quite common sorts of things. Here are some that might be less common in your classrooms. Getting the students to evaluate, to critique and evaluate each other's progress. A useful life skill, isn't it? Learning to give feedback to someone else in a way that is respectful, practical, and useful is a skill. Learning to accept feedback from someone else without becoming defensive or upset is a disposition. It's an attitude, isn't it? So what percentage of your time with your children do you spend explicitly helping them to develop those muscles, those powerful learning muscles of giving and taking feedback? Getting them to critique what they're reading, like those boys in that history lesson. Learning to think critically about the textbook, about what you've just said, about what they read on Wikipedia this morning. Learning to develop that disposition which says, hold on a minute, how do we know it's true? How could we check? Where could we go? Who's an authority in this? Yeah? Developing that disposition. Is that not a 21st century skill? Yeah? I was working in a school a little while ago, and I found myself having coffee with a group of history teachers in that school. We were chatting, and they got talking about their worry that their students were very uncritical about what they read on the internet. Do you share that worry? They read something on Wikipedia and they sort of think it's true, whether or not they plan to copy it down and try and pass it off as their own work. That's a separate question. And I said to these teachers, can you just reassure me that the way you're teaching, whatever it might be, the causes of the First World War, to your students, the way you're getting them to engage with that information is designed to cultivate that skeptical attitude towards knowledge claims that you're now rightly complaining your students don't have? And they went a bit quiet because they hadn't seen that what they were doing in their history lessons was mind training. that their choice was either to train acquiescence and credulity or to train critical and skeptical dispositions. What about designing their own learning activities? How much do you involve your students in contributing to the design of lessons? Getting them to learn how to think like their own teachers. Here's an example. A group of what we call Year 3, 7-year-olds. A lesson that I was in a little while ago. The teacher she explained an activity to the children, and then she said, but before you start on the activity, just spend 1 minute with your learning buddy, and I want you to tell me, what do you think would be the best group size to do that activity in? So they were very used to doing this, these children. Chat, 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 chat. At the end of a minute, hands go up. Some of them thought 2s, and they could give reasons. Some thought 4 would be a good size, and they could give their reasons. But most of the children thought 3s, thought trio would be a good group size. Okay, get into 3s, and off you go. Could you do that with your kids? It takes 3 minutes out of a lesson. Would they be capable of doing that? If not, how long would it take you to train them or coach them until they could? It'd only be a few weeks of practicing how to talk to each other, how to think about the lessons. I've got a teacher friend who does this with 4-year-olds. Anybody teach 4-year-olds who thinks I'm lying? Who thinks, no, you couldn't do it with 4-year-olds? You can, believe me. So what that teacher is doing is constantly adjusting, making small changes to what goes on in her classroom so that she is building collaboration, reflection, thoughtfulness, responsibility, independence in those children. And imagine over the course of a year how much she can do if she's looking for those opportunities. How much she can help the children build their capacity. I saw another example. I do a lot of work with the youth coaches of the Premiership football clubs in England. The coaches who teach the kids, boys, only boys, I'm afraid, in this setup, between ages 11 and 16. We had a demonstration coaching session with a group of boys from Sunderland, not far from where Sugata works. They were 12-year-olds, a group of about 14 12-year-olds. Their coach brought them in a bus to Liverpool Academy, where we were working. He set up a training session with these boys. He set up an exercise for them. And then he said to the rest of us who were watching, just watch what they do. Very quickly, the boys would started to do what they'd been told, but very quickly and very smoothly, they kept checking with each other, is this too easy? Is this too hard? Is this stretching us enough, this activity? Could we change it a little bit so that we're getting a good stretch out of this activity for ourselves, without any help from a teacher? It's a very small example of a group of boys in a conventional setting. They're not trying to, learn for themselves about genetics or DNA or biodiversity. They're simply practicing a soccer maneuver, but they've been coached to think like coaches. Could you do that with your kids? With that mindset, you could, couldn't you? Anybody could weave in a little bit of that kind of thinking. Getting the students to take different perspectives. What would so-and-so have thought about this? Put yourself in the mindset. Be that character. Yeah? Developing those kinds of things. And extended problem solving. Exactly, again, the kind of thing that Sugata has been talking about. And all of these develop the skills that they want for life. Persevering, craftsmanship, empathy, self-coaching, checking knowledge, taking and using feedback, collaborating, reading, understanding, mind training, and so on. Now, there's a lot more kinds of activities that teachers use in their classrooms. But very quickly, draw your circle and draw your pie chart. What kind of a mind trainer are you in your classroom? 1 minute. Okay, I'm going to try and get your attention back again, if I may. So, if we had longer, I could get you to work with that information in more detail. These are some of the questions that you could explore. So having created your own view of yourself, you could compare that with your neighbor. You could think, how similar or different are they? You could see where there are some surprises. You could ask yourself, how confident are you? How self-aware are you as a mind trainer? Or is all your attention on the subject matter and the content and classroom discipline and all the other stuff of being a teacher? When you're designing an activity for your students, do you think, now, which learning muscle am I going to stretch today? How am I going to use adding fractions as an exercise machine to develop collaboration or resilience or the ability to resist distractions while you're working, to build concentration, for example? Any teacher could think like that if we got used to it. So how confident are you that you see yourself clearly as someone who coaches the development of mental habits? And here's another question. How could your school get better data? How could you become more conscious, more explicit, more precise, more accurate about this aspect of what goes on in your school? Would it be interesting to get better data about the kind of mental training that goes on in your classrooms? Where and how is this aspect of what's going on in school discussed and reviewed? Do you talk about it in staff meetings? Do you engage the children in talking and thinking about which of their mental muscles are they good at or not so good at? And how could they set themselves a target to become a bit better at collaborating with girls, or not noticing when a distraction happens in the classroom? Could you help them become self-training in developing these kinds of things? So I'd like you to so my general question is, there's no right or wrong answer to this, Would that exercise and these questions make the basis of a useful professional development activity when you go back to school? 30 seconds, chat. Okay, lovely. Thank you very much indeed. If I can call you back again. Okay, thank you. So, I'm very happy to make these slides available to you. I'm sure Silvana could find a way of making them available to schools. In the brief time I have, we can't go into these questions as deeply as we might, but with a bit of luck, I can sow some seeds of things that you might want to try. Some different kinds of conversations that you might want to have in your schools when you go back. We've done a lot of research on this perspective recently, which we've summarized in this book called The Learning Powered School. And one of the things that we've discovered is that a school needs to be really clear about what are the mental habits, the mental muscles that we really think we want to help our youngsters develop, those green-sided things. And there's a lot of different ways of carving that up. You can have, some people have a list that's as short as 4 things. Some people have a list that is 17 or 18 things. Art Costa's Habits of Mind is 16 or 17. In the original Building Learning Power books, we had 17 different habits. But for some people, that's too many. It's too hard to get your head around those. So let me just suggest, this is not a solution. This is a suggestion. Things you might start to think about, of the learning habits that you might think to yourself, how could we target those more effectively, more successfully in our history lessons, our English lessons, our Spanish lessons, our geography lessons, our football training, our religious education, in every aspect of the life in the school. And most of these we've talked about. Getting the students to ask more questions, not becoming passive. In English schools, it happens very often that by the time students are 12 or 14 or 15 years old, they have become elective mutes. They don't ask anything because they're only interested in what's on the test, and they're afraid that if they ask a question, their other students will laugh at them. It's up to us whether we create that unsafe environment in our classrooms or not. It's our job to make our classrooms a safe place to experiment, to think aloud, to offer a half-thought-out answer, because that's what learning is, isn't it? If we are preoccupied only with correctness, only with performance, we make the classroom unsafe for students to think. Whatever we say we're making it unsafe for them. Because learning is a messy, slow business that requires doubt, that involves doubt and uncertainty and experimentation. So the first and most basic thing is to make sure that we create that atmosphere in our classroom within which it's safe to ask questions. Testing the validity of knowledge claims. Do you invite your students to check whether what you've said is true or not? How often do your students say to you, "Excuse me, miss, how do we know that's true?" And would you welcome it if they did? Because you have to be honest about this. Generating ideas, imagining possible solutions was the phrase I used earlier. Reflecting on what they've produced and thinking about how to improve it. That's the mindset of a craftsman. A craftsman is someone who puts in effort to produce the best possible product they can and feel proud of it. A craftsman understands the satisfaction, the feeling of fulfillment that lies on the other side of effort and struggle. And that's a very powerful gift to give to our children, isn't it? That realization. Working well in groups. We've already talked about that one. Adopting different perspectives, offering and accepting feedback. So if you're at a loss, this is my starter kit for you. Change it, modify it, critique it, adapt it. Please. Because I don't want you to be passive, compliant, dependent learners of building learning power, do I? That would be a contradiction. I want you to say, how does he know? How could we check? Yeah? How would we experiment with this? How could we improve on this formulation? One of the things that we found is really useful is just to keep using this metaphor that I've been talking about of yourself as a mind coach, just like a sports coach, like a fitness coach. You keep talking to the kids, explaining to them that their brains are like muscles. There's a lot of work in this territory which is very well known by a wonderful researcher from Harvard called Carol Dweck. Some of you may know her work. Brains are like muscles. They get stronger and smarter through exercise. Through finding learning difficult is how we get smarter. Hammering that message into your students' brains is really important. Subjects are like exercise machines. Mathematics is good for developing logical reasoning, careful checking of what you've done for yourself, not relying on the teacher, collaboration and discussion, and so on. Each lesson that you design is another mental workout. The curriculum as a whole is a broad and balanced approach to developing a wide range of mental habits, which are the ones we said we thought they'd need to flourish in the real world of the 21st century. Bright slackers are wasting their time. What does that mean? In many classes, there are a small group of kids who love giving right answers. Right? This is the only exercise they get in your classroom. Going like this. They tend to sit at the front. And unfortunately, many of them have become addicted to rightness, to correctness. What they're doing is getting a fix 12 times a day, 100 times a day, that they can be smart, they can look smart without effort. That would be like somebody going to the local gym, the fitness center, changing into their fancy workout gear, your turquoise leotard. I was going to say I had a turquoise leotard, but I don't. With a friend, sitting down quietly in a corner of the gym, sharing a bottle of Malbec, having a good chat, and then having a shower and going home. It has its appeal, actually, doesn't it? But you didn't have to go to the gym to do that. The reason why you go to the gym is to get hot and sweaty and tired, because that way you get fitter. The reason why all your kids come to your school is to get hot and sweaty and tired mentally, because that's the way they get smarter. And we need to help them understand that message. Otherwise, they're wasting their time. So what is building learning power? In my session this afternoon, I'm going to go in much more detail into the small shifts that any teacher can make in her classroom in order to shift that culture from the red side to the green side. Lots of practical. If you're liking what you're hearing so far, you'll probably also be feeling frustrated. Yes, but how? Tell me how to do it. Give me the hints and tips. Well, this afternoon is the hints and tips session, if any of you are interested. But I just want to give you a preview of the kinds of things that we'll talk about in that session this afternoon. Building learning power is an army. It's an army of about 30,000 teachers around the world at the moment. Some in Argentina, some in Ushuaia, some in Rosario, some in Buenos Aires, in Finland, in Malaysia, in Dubai, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Chile. Teachers who care, who are passionate about finding new small ways to deliver a genuinely 21st century education. And I talk to as many of these teachers as I can, and I steal their ideas. And I tell other people about them, which is what I'm going to be doing this afternoon. So what are the things that we can change that many of those teachers have discovered make a difference to whether you have a mind-numbing or a mind-expanding classroom? Firstly, small shifts in how we talk to and about students, the kinds of language that we use. Secondly, a shift in what we model. How much do we model for our students someone who is a confident learner? That's to say, someone who is completely cheerful when they make a mistake, when they forget something, when their lesson planning turns out wrong. Do you model someone who is unapologetic, non-defensive, as being a learner in your own right? Or do you model someone who is always busy pretending to be omniscient, to know everything? How we design lessons. I've already given you some examples of that. That example with the boys wearing the empathy specs was an example of what we call a split-screen lesson. 2 objectives. Learn about the Tudors, stretch your empathy muscles. Going on at the same time, woven together in that lesson. Building learning power teachers get very smart at thinking about how to design split-screen lessons that achieve those 2 objectives simultaneously. What we display, even the things that we put up on the walls, carry messages about whether we value the messy business of learning or whether we only care about the polished pretense of perfection or success at the end. What we record and report about students and the way we involve students in recording and reporting about themselves, about their own development as learners. Do we treat them as partners in this long-term coaching apprenticeship? You would be a pretty poor sports coach if you didn't talk to your athlete about, so where are we now? What would be your next personal best? How do we design together your next training target? You would be what we call technically a crap coach, wouldn't you? If you didn't design these things as a result of conversation with your athlete. And the same in classrooms. How we work together, how we as teachers work together. Learning turns out to be highly contagious. If children find themselves in a community of adults who are busy imagining, discussing, debating, experimenting, arguing, tinkering, changing their practice, who are enthusiastic about improving, about getting better, those attitudes are contagious. The children pick them up. Vygotsky, you all study Vygotsky when you're students? Vygotsky said very crudely, we get our minds from the people we hang out with, right? And children hang out with you quite a lot. So our attitudes, collectively and individually, are really important. And also how a school plans and develops. We discovered a lot of information about how to create a campaign in a school, how to gradually, because this is a gradual process, not a revolution. On Monday, do something a little bit different, but keep doing it, don't give up. And when that's become embedded in your practice, add another little thing that's a bit different. Gradually build up this culture in your individual teaching, but also in the life of the school as a whole. So this becomes quite an interesting journey, individually for a teacher, because it's about us shifting our habits, collectively for a school, because it's about a journey of 3 years or 4 years, which is deliberately shifting the culture of the school from that red-sided to that green-sided set of preoccupations. What we discovered from our research, looking at the schools that had been successful in this venture, could be distilled into 3 words. The first word is, it's difficult. Because we're people, we're creatures of habit. It requires discussion and argument and not quite knowing and trying something new. We have to be learners. The second word, however, is possible. I know beyond any doubt that a school that invests in thinking and talking this way will find astonishing shifts in their students in a year's time. And the third word, of course, is vital. Because if we're not paying attention to this dimension of what goes on in schools, I think we've lost the plot as far as educators is concerned. In our preoccupation with subject matter and tests and university entrance and curriculum prescriptions, if we've lost the heart of education, which is preparing all the youngsters in our schools with the skills, the attitudes, the tools they need to flourish in life in the 21st century, whether they're going to be a hairdresser or a cowboy or a brain surgeon or a teacher, it doesn't matter. It's not about which chunk of the workforce you're going to go into. It's about, are you going to have a mind that is strong enough, flexible enough, supple enough to cope with all the difficulties and complexities that the 21st century is going to throw at you. And if us in our room, politicians aren't going to do it for us. Politicians always do too little, too late. It's our job to be the pioneers. And that means doing one small thing differently next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. And still we've got more to go, right? So now we're going to see how to do it. Very enriching morning, self-driven education, habits of mind, training muscles and brain, right? Very interesting. But in order to continue this enriching morning, we have to think about other dimensions. So get ready after lunch for Learning in a Networked World with Will Richardson. And then what should schools look like? Should buildings be the same? For the first time, architect Hamish Boyd, who will be talking about designing schools inside out. So, time for lunch. We'll meet you here at 1:15. And what we are going to do is to leave this room and go downstairs, one floor, and walk straight to the left. And we meet there at San Telmo room, back here, 1:15. Thank you.
All right?
Yeah, it was very
Yeah.
good. Thank